All right. Sorry, live stream just was not working. I don't know. I would have video and not audio, or audio and no video, and it just I don't know. So it just wasn't working. So this will be a recorded video that's uploaded later, and hopefully I can get these problems figured out. Something seems like something has changed with the platform, YouTube, Facebook. That is, for some reason, my previous setup is now not working correctly. So I'm going to just got to do some digging into that and to see what it is they've changed, what it is I'm going to have to do to get that going. But this is our Bible study looking at Psalm 12 this evening. I do want to mention, just before we get started, just to give an update particularly to the members of the Church at Harmony. As we continue to move forward as a church, we are going to have to come up with our plan for reopening, the way that we're going to conduct services and such. And so, as I understand it, we're going to have to submit a plan. Prior to doing that, we'll have to submit a plan to the county. And so currently I'm working on gathering information from the various federal, state, and local sources to put together a plan. In other words, figuring out what exactly is going to be required for reopening and when that can happen and so on. And so I'll be sending some updates. Most likely will be letters that'll be mailed out so that all the members receive them. And then, as a church, we can make decisions on how we're going to proceed. So just ask you to be patient, and I will be trying to keep everyone up to date until we can finally get to the point where we're ready to decide on something. So anyway, just wanted to let you know that is what is going on currently, and we will be moving forward with that, Lord willing, and hopefully sooner rather than later being able to meet together once again. All right, so I do want to get to the Bible study for tonight. We are looking at Psalm number 12. We have been doing a biblical theology of the Psalms, going psalm by psalm, and so now we have come to Psalm number 12. All right, so our summary of Psalm number 12. Psalm 12 puts hope in God's pure words because His thoughts and actions are the same as opposed to the lies of the wicked. All right, so let me go over that one more time. That's the summary of the psalm. Psalm 12 puts hope in God's pure words because His thoughts and actions are the same as opposed to the lies of the wicked. To outline this psalm, I did it in two main parts. Verses 1 to 4, which verses 1 to 4 speak of perverse words. Verses 5 to 8 speak of pure words. All right, so we move on to our observation for Psalm number 12. The inscription to the chief musician upon Sheminith, a Psalm of David. So Psalm 12 was written by David, as it's described to him there in the heading. There's no mention of any specific occasion for this psalm. It is directed once again to the chief musician or to the choir master. And we have encountered this term before, Sheminith, in Psalm number 6. It means upon the 8. So it is the same word that's used there. It's a word that we're not entirely certain of the meaning of. It could refer to some sort of an 8-stringed instrument, such as a lyre or something. Could possibly refer to the octave, and that would be giving some sort of direction for different parts in singing the psalm. But again, we're not entirely certain about that. Psalm number 12 is not typically categorized as a community lament psalm. Usually it's referred to as an individual lament. Personally, I would categorize it as a community lament, and it fits the conventions of a community lament that we see in some other places in the Psalms. And also, when you look at verse number 7, the expression of confidence, in God to preserve the faithful, we find David using the first person plural, speaking of us. Thou shalt preserve them, or thou shalt preserve us from this generation forever. So it does seem to be a community lament, as David has in mind the community of the faithful. And as far as the conventions that it follows, it begins with a call to God and a petition for help in verse number 1. Verses 1 and 2 then proceed to give the complaint or the particular crisis that the psalmist is lamenting. Verses 3 to 5 are a reflection on God's disposition toward the false speakers. The middle of this psalm gives a divine oracle, which is not extremely common in the Psalms. It's a response from God, so it's a direct statement from God Himself in verse 5. Verse 6 is a reflection on the purity of God's words after that He has spoken that oracle. And verse 7 expresses confidence in God keeping His word. And then we come to verse number 8 that ends the psalm, and verse 8 departs from the lament convention, and it's a return to the present crisis, which is somewhat unique among the lament, particularly the community lament type psalms. Now, when we look at this psalm in terms of time, I would subcategorize this psalm as a prophetic lament. And that's because the time period alternates between David's present in verses 1 to 2, the future actions of God based on His words in verses 3 to 7, and the present again with the future not yet realized in verse number 8. So this justifies David's confidence, and it gives him present hope because of future fulfillment. In other words, the crisis of this lament is spoken, but it will not always be this way. I would also call this a wisdom psalm because it focuses on speech and it contrasts the speech of the wicked with the pure, reliable speech of God. All right, so let's do a quick walkthrough of this psalm, a short psalm, 8 verses. Help, Lord, for the godly man ceaseth, for the faithful fail from among the children of men. They speak vanity, every one with his neighbor. With flattering lips and with a double heart do they speak. The Lord shall cut off all flattering lips, and the tongue that speaketh proud things. Who have said, with our tongue will we prevail. Our lips are our own. Who is Lord over us? For the oppression of the poor, for the sighing of the needy. Now will I arise, saith the Lord. I will set him in safety from him that puffeth at him. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord. Thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. The wicked walk on every side when the vilest men are exalted. All right, so verses 1 to 2 open this psalm calling on God for help. And then it moves quickly to the crisis in this psalm. So you have the immediate statement, help Lord, and then moving to the crisis. So David says that the godly and the faithful are disappearing from the earth. In essence, they are ceasing or failing from among the children of men. Now the word for godly that is used is most often translated saints, and it's a term that describes those who are consecrated or devoted to God's covenant. And you can see just such a usage in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verses 8 to 9. The word for faithful emphasizes loyalty, and it means truth and certainty. The Hebrew word actually that is used there, aman, ultimately comes into English as our word amen, which is we would say, so be it, or let it be, or that's truth or certain in the Hebrew word. Now the first verse does use hyperbole to describe the circumstance. And, the godly man is ceasing and the faithful are failing. They're describing the circumstance where the faithful are essentially disappearing from the earth. They're threatened to become non-existent upon the earth. Now, again, this is not an individual lament of the sort. If this were an individual lament, then it would seem like that David would be calling for help because he's the only one left. But that's not really what we have described here in this psalm. So think about the mention of the poor and needy in verse number 5. And then you also have the second line of verse number 7 that refers to us, or we. So David's concern is the apparent shrinking or the disappearing of the community of the faithful. This is further supported by the fact that the covenant name of God, Yahweh, appears 5 times in this psalm. And in fact, it's the only name of God or that's directly addressed to Him that is used in this psalm. The only other word similar to that will be used in verse 4 when the wicked ask, who is Lord over us? And that's the Hebrew word Adon. So it's basically saying, who is the Lord, who is the master over us? It's not a direct reference to God in heaven. So the only name for God that's used in this psalm is Yahweh, which is a covenant name of God. We also see in the first verse that phrase, among the children of men, and we have that phrase is it is literally the sons of Adam. In other words, his perspective is here on the earth and the situation on the earth and the prevalence of wickedness or the prevalence of falsehood, the prevalence of lies, the prevalence of harmful speech on the earth. So that's the crisis, false speech that is so prevalent in the community, and that is reinforced by the mention of neighbor in verse number 2. They speak vanity, everyone with his neighbor. So that reinforces the lack of justice within a community. There's unrighteousness or unjust treatment among one another. He identifies this vanity, this is empty talk and flattery and double talk. And he's saying that these things abound throughout the community. Now, double talk is where the words and or the actions do not align with the internal thoughts. So you have an internal motive or an internal design that is not consistent, saying one thing or taking advantage or what have you. Then we come to verses 3 to 4, and here we have a reflection on God's future judgment. So we do have a very vivid image that is used. The Lord shall cut off all flattering lips and the tongue that speaketh proud things. Now literally, the psalmist David here is saying that the Lord will cut the lips off of those that are flatterers, and He's going to cut off the tongue of those that speak pride or proud things. So the imagery is obviously a figure of their destruction, but it also emphasizes and agrees with what we saw for instance, in Psalm 1, verses 5 and 6, how that they will not stand and how their way will perish. In other words, the language of being cut off is a common figure of being cut off from the covenant, being cut off from the community of the faithful, being cut off from salvation, from the blessings, from eternal life, from the kingdom of the Messiah, and so on. Now, he also speaks here when he says of cutting off of all flattering lips and such. He's speaking in terms of finality. So the future judgment and the establishment of righteousness on the earth is certainly in view. The proud speech that he refers to, particularly in verse number 4, is overconfidence, and it is defiance of God, reminding us of both the counsels of the ungodly, like in Psalm 1:1, and the rebellion of the nations in Psalm 2, 1 to 3. Who will be Lord over us? We shall prevail, and so on. Verse 5 then gives Yahweh speaking in response to the crisis. So this is the divine oracle that is given. He hears, as he says, the groaning or the sighing of the needy and of the oppressed. That, of course, reminds us of God's words to Moses before sending him to Egypt to deliver the people. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, he speaks about how he heard, the cries of the afflicted of his people he has heard, and that's why he is sending Moses in to deliver them. So that's the same idea that God has heard the oppression of the poor and the sighing of the needy, and so now he's going to arise and going to deliver him or set him in safety from those that puff or the arrogant that boast against them. Now, we have seen God petitioned to arise up. We've seen that before, like in Psalms 3:7 and Psalm 7:6, Psalm 9:19, Psalm 10:12. And in all of those instances, God will rise up to judge the wicked. And here God speaks of his own rising. And essentially he's giving his answer to the crisis that's being lamented. God says, I'm going to rise up. I'm going to arise, which means that he's going to bring judgment upon them. Now, all of those instances, speaking of God arising, all of those instances that in the previous Psalms that we mentioned as well as here, they make a distinction between the present time of the psalmist and of the future time. So when you think about the way that it's used here, where God is speaking, giving this divine oracle that he's going to arise, he is looking to the future when God will rise up. In other words, God promises to arise. In other words, there's a time when God's judgment is not being enacted. There's a time when there's forbearance and there's long suffering and there's patience, and it's not being enacted. Of course, we saw in Psalm 2 that this is going to come with the installation of his king upon Zion. So he promises at the end of verse 5 that he's going to set the faithful in safety. And that's the word for safety there is a form of the word help that is used in verse number 1. So we see that correspondence and that repetition certainly tells us that this is God's response to the cry of petition. Then we go on to verse number 6. And verse 6 is a reflection on the purity of God's words. So God has just spoken, and verse 6 gives a reflection on the purity of his words. And there's imagery that is used, that of refining silver. Now, the process of refining silver is not the point, but the product. In other words, this is a simile. So there's a comparison. God's spoken or revealed words are comparable to the product of silver purified 7 times. So 7 takes the expression to the highest possible degree. In other words, it's saying silver so pure that it can't be purified anymore. It's another way that it could be said that God's words are flawless. So this verse also contrasts with God with the double heart that was mentioned in verse 2 of the psalm. The double heart, or the hypocrisy of the vain talkers. So God's words are pure, they are flawless, as opposed to the vain talkers which speak with 2 hearts. In other words, or 2 minds. They say one thing and they're meaning something else. And then we have verse number 7, which is the expression of confidence in God. The first line of verse 7 states that God will keep his words. The word indicates guarding. He's going to guard. He's going to keep them from failing. The second line states that God will preserve us. And again, the first person plural is used. He will guard or watch over the faithful so that they will not suffer the same fate as the wicked. In other words, thou shalt preserve them from this generation. This generation then would refer to the group of the wicked that are speaking in the lies and the flattery and whatnot. He will preserve them from the same fate. And we see the same idea echoed later in the Psalms as well. Verse number 8 then returns to the present time of the psalmist. The first phrase pictures the wicked strutting around. They walk on every side, but they walk freely. They walk in their pride, and that's obviously a theme in the psalm. Vileness, the vilest of men that he speaks of worthlessness and also of shameful excess. And essentially, the present situation is lamentable because wicked men are able to strut around when the vilest of men are exalted or are lifted up. In other words, they're in positions of power. All right, so let's move to interpretation for Psalm number 12. Now, Psalm 12 does focus on the power of words. And this psalm keeps a close association between the words that are spoken on one hand and the character of the speaker or the speakers. So, for instance, when he talks early in the psalm about vanity, which is empty speech, and talks about flattery, he notes that it comes from a double heart. All right, so double talk is obviously hypocritical speech. The speech and or the actions of a person do not correspond to the thoughts of his heart. Like the image of a rotten tree producing rotten fruit in places like Luke chapter 6 and verse number 43. James also spoke of the image of a fountain or a spring of water that can't give both salt water and fresh. It can't give both sweet and bitter at the same time. They're coming from the same source. And the water that flows out at the spring is the water that comes from the source. Now, in this psalm, words that come from God are contrasted, obviously, and they are flawless. And we see that particularly in verses 5 to 7. So the Old Testament consistently puts confidence in God's words because of God's character. In other words, it's God's character that stands behind His words. And so therefore you can be confident. So think of it maybe in these terms. If you have someone who is known, has a reputation for being a liar and a cheat, a swindler, or whatever you want to say, then when they make you a promise or they speak words to you, or maybe even just someone who has a reputation for being an empty talker, they make promises that they don't keep, and they speak of things that they don't do, things that never come true or never come to be. Well, in this case, you're not going to trust those words. How much confidence are you going to put in the words of someone that proves themselves to be a liar? Well, you're not going to put confidence in their words. So in the Old Testament, confidence is putting God's words because of His character, because He's righteous, because He's just, because He's true, and He speaks words of truth and justice and righteousness. So you can think about a few verses like Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 8. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. Isaiah 45:23. I have sworn by myself, the word is gone out of my mouth in righteousness and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. Isaiah 55:11. So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. So it's the character of God behind the words that He has given. That's what gives David confidence in this psalm. He begins and ends the psalm with his present circumstance, where the faithful are disappearing and the wicked are flourishing and strutting around. But he has confidence in God's words because of God's character, because he knows who God is. All right, so that brings us in our interpretation to the Messianic hope in this psalm. And when we are considering the Messianic hope in this psalm, it actually relies very much on the theme of words in this particular psalm. So the Messianic hope in this psalm to consider that, we have to ask, what words are the words in verse 6, the words of the Lord are pure words? What words are the foundation of David's hope and confidence? Now, this psalm features something of a rare divine oracle in verse number 5, where God speaks directly, and His words evoke that Exodus imagery. His declaration to arise is paralleled in such promises as the woe to Assyria. In Isaiah 33:10, "Now will I rise, saith the Lord. Now will I be exalted. Now will I lift myself up." And he's speaking there of rising up in judgment to bring righteousness to the earth. So the Lord also said He will set the afflicted in safety. So the imagery of deliverance and restoration of Israel is spoken in similar terms. Isaiah 26:1, "In that day shall this song be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. Salvation will God appoint for walls and bulwarks." God will set them in safety. All right, so the words that David has so much confidence in are the words of the covenant that God made with him. Particularly think about 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 10. "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time." Again, those are words directly from the covenant that God made with David. So as David is thinking about the community of the faithful and how they're shrinking and disappearing, the godless seem to be multiplying, the wicked are strutting around, able to boast of their proud things, lies and injustice and oppression from neighbor to neighbor is abounding. That promise that God made is not being realized in David's time. But yet he knows that God's words are pure. God has spoken those words. He has promised them. Later on in 2 Samuel chapter 7, he's going to bring this about through the seed of David. It's not going to come about through David himself, but through the seed of David that's going to establish the throne and the kingdom, that's going to bring righteousness to the earth. So these are the words that David is trusting in. These are the pure words that are purer than silver that's been refined 7 times. These are the words he has confidence in. Now, when David speaks of the vilest of men at the end of this psalm, he's talking about men being exalted, when the vilest of men are exalted or lifted up. And that causes the wicked to flourish and to strut around on every side. The same word for exalted here is used in Psalm 3:3 and in Psalm 9:19 to refer to exaltation to rule, lifting up of the head, lifting up from the grave to the gates. So David sees presently that the earth is not being ruled by the godly man, and that's what he's looking forward to. Now Psalm 2 again gives the answer to the wicked rulers of the earth, and that answer is the installation of God's anointed Son King to the throne in Zion. Psalm 2 verses 6 to 7. And His rule, we are told there in verses 8 to 9 of Psalm 2, will establish righteousness on the earth. These are the words that David has confidence in. These are the pure words of the Lord that's going to bring His Messiah and His kingdom to the earth, so that the wicked is not going to flourish and prosper. They're not going to strut around. Lies are not going to prevail, but justice and righteousness will be established. And these words are also the words that comforted David as he was dying. So if we think about 2 Samuel chapter number 23 in verses 1 to 7. "Now these be the last words of David. David the son of Jesse said, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel said, The Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and His word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, The Rock of Israel spake to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun riseth, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. Although my house be not so with God, yet he hath made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire, although he make it not to grow. But the sons of Belial shall be all of them as thorns thrust away, because they cannot be taken with hands. But the man that shall touch them must be fenced with iron, and the staff of a spear, and they shall be utterly burned with fire in the same place. So these are the words. That's the messianic hope. God's words are pure. He's going to bring His Messiah. He's going to bring His kingdom. He will sit on David's throne. He will be of the seed of David. He will plant the people of Israel in safety, and He will cause the wicked to cease from the earth. All right, that brings us to our application for this psalm. I have two of these. Number one, understanding Psalm 12 does help us understand the power of words. Words are only worth what the character of the speaker is worth. And so we should be moved to use wisdom in speaking words, care to speak words of truth and righteousness. We should also understand not to trust in the words of fools and God haters who seek to lead us astray. So again, that has a very Proverbs, wisdom type character in this particular psalm. Application number two, understanding Psalm 12 helps us understand that God has spoken sure words about the future. Our present circumstances are not what will always be. And though we are afflicted by the lying vanities in the world, we will not suffer the fate of the wicked, those who have put their trust in Jesus Christ. Our hope, just like David's here, is in the coming kingdom of Christ, and that's the hope expressed in the model prayer, particularly Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. So we have that same future-oriented, forward-looking hope based in the purity of God's words that are backed by His own character. All right, that's all of our study in Psalm 12. Once again, I am sorry for the trouble for the live stream earlier, but hopefully at least you'll be able to view this video and to follow along the study in Psalm 12. I'm going to have a word of prayer and I'm going to be finished. Almighty Father in heaven, Lord, I do thank You for the blessings that You have given, and I do thank You for this opportunity to study Your Word. Father, I pray that You just would help us as we just continue to try to navigate these difficult times, and sometimes the technology doesn't work, and whatever problems that we have. But Father, I do pray Your continued blessing, Your hand be upon us. Give us wisdom, and as we work as a church together toward being able to have services again, we just pray that You would give us guidance and wisdom in those things as well. Pray all these things tonight in the holy and precious name of Jesus Christ, and amen.